The title of my talk is Serendipity. You're probably wondering what that means and why I am giving it. First, what is serendipity? It is the faculty of making happy and unexpected discoveries by accident. Also, the fact or an instance of such a discovery. Now, what I'm going to talk about really isn't the things that I've achieved. What I'm going to talk about is how I got here, this place, this time. And I'm going to end at the very end by telling you about my academic career. And my lessons are going to be that you can't start an academic career without curiosity, a lifelong love of learning, role models, learning from great mentors, support from family and friends, and serendipity. We're going to go back in time, and we're going to go back to 1926 in Łódź, Poland. The young girl, who you can see her head is right here, that was my mother. And in 1939, just about a decade later, my Rose Kryger married Sam, who was a butcher. And about 3 months after their marriage, Germany invaded Poland, and that was the beginning of a Holocaust. My parents spent a great deal of time in slave labor camps, and when the war ended in 1945, they were refugees. This is my father's refugee certificate. He was a butcher, and I was born 2 years after the war ended in 1947. So I grew up, my family first went to Israel, then we ended up in Canada. I grew up in Montreal. In about 1960, my father became comatose and he was admitted to the Montreal Neurological Institute. I went into my father's room and saw his doctor, Wilder Penfield, who had an instrument in my father's head. I asked, "What is that?" He answered, "Radar." Radar was in fact the precursor of what we now call ultrasound in medicine. He subsequently evacuated a subdural hematoma and my father woke up. I was hooked to be a doctor. I decided that I wanted to be a neurosurgeon. That was my first contact with Wilder Penfield. My second contact with him was in 1968. And I was in medical school, and Wilder Penfield was the professor of neurosurgery. And those of you who have taken any cognitive science or any neuroscience, whether you know it or not, a great deal of what Wilder Penfield developed, you know about. He actually is the person that did the representations of various parts of the brain and what functions they actually controlled in a brilliant series of experiments. Well, I was a medical student, and medical students really don't know much about their professors. I had no idea how famous this guy was, but what I did know is what he taught and what he told the students. If you can't build a house, don't go into neurosurgery. Well, I was a bit of a klutz, and I decided right then and there that I wasn't going to go into neurosurgery. So during medical school, I had some amazing mentors. My first year physiology professor who taught respiratory physiology was Joseph Millick Emily. That name won't mean much to you, but he was one of the first people that actually measured pleural pressure using an esophageal balloon. And he was a genius in lung mechanics. During the summers, I did research projects with under the supervision of Peter Macklem. And Peter was a real world authority on COPD, on emphysema, and small airways. And it was, again, as a student, I had no idea how famous these guys actually were. So Peter, a lot of the work that he was doing was with animal models of emphysema. And I discovered very quickly that this was not for me. I didn't relish the thought of giving a cute beagle, for example, emphysema by blowing chemicals into its lungs. And I got really fascinated by the mechanics of the lung. And the other supervisor that I had at that time was Dr. Nick Antonison. And Nick Antonison, he studied exercise physiology at depth. And one of the reasons for that was that North Sea oil was being discovered, and people didn't really know at that time the exercise ability of people who were under 200, 300, 400 feet below the surface of water. So that resulted in me doing some experiments in this area, and it became, eventually I presented this at Grand Rounds. What I presented at Grand Rounds was myself. So this was the chamber in which we did the exercise testing. This was on the 3rd floor of the Royal Victoria Hospital. And after one of the sessions where I was collecting data on a subject on a bicycle at 200 feet roughly below the surface of sea level, the experiment was over. I left the chamber, and as I was walking away, I became hemi-paralyzed. One side of my body became completely paralyzed, and I was dragged back into the chamber where Peter Macklem was with me for 6 hours inside the chamber, and Nick Antonison was outside the chamber controlling all the dials and all the pressures inside. Now, Nick had a great experience in this because he had been a U.S. Navy diver before he actually became a professor at McGill. So they brought me back to health, and to this day, I have to thank them that I'm not hemi-paralyzed. But that experience taught me something very important. It taught me statistics. And what I mean by it taught me statistics is that the tables we were using for returning to sea level from depth were 95% confidence tables. And what that meant was 5% of the time when you use these tables, you would have an adverse event. And this ended, for me, this type of research. So 1973 to 1974, my interests evolved further. I became fascinated with the physiology of the upper airway, the control of breathing, and this now linked the respiratory system and the brain. And this really was serendipity for the next phase of my life. 1973, I was on an internal medicine endocrine ward, and this was the start of my sleep medicine career, a single case. Up to that time, I was not really interested in sleep at all. I never really thought about it. And it started with a case, a 42-year-old obese male who had severe daytime sleepiness for the past 2 to 3 years, urinary incontinence for the past 2 to 3 years, a 4 to 5 month history of nocturnal seizures, and on nightly rounds. I used to make rounds at night and in the evening to see my patients, and I saw that he was struggling to breathe, and he didn't fit the medical literature. And at that time, I was pretty up to date with the medical literature, and the case that I thought, the disease that I thought he might have, was described in 1956, a famous case report, where the patient was accustomed to playing poker once a week, and on this crucial occasion he was dealt a hand of 3 aces and 2 kings, a full house. Because he had dropped off to sleep, he failed to take advantage of the opportunity. Well, this was the description of what the authors called the Pickwickian syndrome. And they described this as being a disorder where the features were obesity, somnolence or severe sleepiness, twitching, cyanosis, periodic respiration, a waxing and waning of breathing, right ventricular hypertrophy. In other words, the right side of the heart, the muscle was hypertrophied, it was enlarged, and failure of the right ventricle of the heart. And the hypothesis was that it was an elevation in PCO2 which results in hypoventilation that was resulting in all of these symptoms. Well, this patient did not have hypoventilation. We measured his blood gases and they were completely normal. So he didn't have this disease. So this led me to read some of the sources that might help. And to take you back to 1973, there was no internet. There was no internet. There was no, the papers were not digitized. You actually had to go into the library, and the library at McGill was the Osler Library. And there, after hunting around a lot, I found this journal, Bulletin de Physiopathologie Respiratoire. And in this journal, there were several articles that looked at sleep in patients with the Pickwickian syndrome, which my patient, as I said, did not have. So I went back and actually read the book, and this was written in 1836. It was written by Charles Dickens. He was barely 20 years old, published his first novel, The Posthumous Papers of the Pickwick Club, and he introduces us in this book to Joe the Fat Boy. And on the box sat a fat and red-faced boy in a state of somnolency. And Joe had the features that were described in the 1956 paper 120 years later. But he had another feature which was not emphasized in the 1956 paper. He snored, and he snored loudly. So moving forward by 101 years after Dickens, a paper written by Annie Spitz in 1937. Annie Spitz, I was never able to find any other articles by her, and she probably died during the Holocaust. She described 3 cases that had cyanosis, which is blueness of the fingers and lips and face because of a low blood oxygen, sleepiness, which she called narcolepsy, and right-sided heart failure. And she described that these patients had Cheyne-Stokes respiration, a waxing and waning of breathing, snoring, and apneas. My God, she was on the right track, but she wasn't on the right track because she believed that the disorder was caused by polycythemia, an elevation of the amount of blood, of the red cells in the blood. And this is actually a photograph from her article. And we see this kind of patient in our clinics every single day. So she was on the right track, but she wasn't quite right. So to go back to 1973, I had this patient that had seizures during sleep. I saw the patient struggle during sleep, and a neurosurgery resident who was a friend at the time, we put together something to study this patient's sleep. Now, in 1973, there were no oximeters available that could record data continuously over long periods of time. So what we recorded were the brain waves, eye movements, nasal respiration with a thermistor, oral respiration with a thermistor, and a belt to measure effort to breathe, and an EKG. And what we found is that the patient developed obstruction. He was trying to breathe at a time when there was no airflow happening, so this patient was obstructed. And look at the EKG. So the EKG showed this. And what what happened to this patient is that he would develop very abnormal atrial beats, and he had asystoles lasting as long as 10 seconds, and that was the problem. He would go into an atrial fibrillation flutter pattern when he was struggling to breathe in. So that was the explanation for the seizures. So I had a fairly good idea of what was going on in this guy. And I went to Nick Antonison, who at the time was sort of the guy in charge of me. And I explained what was going on. I explained what I thought was happening. And I said, I think we need to do a tracheostomy here. And Nick, who had a great deal of faith in me, who was a wonderful mentor, said, go right ahead. Go right ahead. Which we did. So the treatment was tracheostomy. The patient's sleepiness resolved, seizures resolved, arrhythmias resolved. The patient was cured, and that resulted in my second grand rounds at McGill, where I presented this, what I thought was a new syndrome, and we called the syndrome the sleep deprivation syndrome of the obese patient. So this was the first paper that I ever wrote, and Dr. Kesney was the neurosurgery fellow or resident, and Dr. Pierre Glour, who was Dr. Kesney's supervisor, I learned years later was a god of epilepsy. This was, he was like one of the best known people in his field. So this was my first paper that I wrote from start to finish. And so I submitted the paper to the American Journal of Medicine. Why did I pick that journal? I picked that journal because that was the journal that had published the paper about the Pickwickian syndrome. And the paper was published, and for the first and last time of my life, the paper was published without a single request from the journal to make any changes. They simply basically said, we're going to publish this without any changes, which they did. So this was 1974. So 1974 was a big year. It was a huge year. This was the year that I was married. That's my wife, Barbara. And Barbara, who was a psychologist, had accepted a position to do graduate work at Colorado State University, and I followed her. We both went off to Colorado, and at that time there were no matching programs. If you wanted to go somewhere to train, you simply wrote a letter with some recommendation letters from people that you had worked with to the head of the program, and you would be accepted, and that's what happened. I ended up going to the University of Colorado Medical Center, and my wife went to Colorado State. The two places were 80 miles apart, and I traveled north, and she traveled south every single morning. So in 1974, who were my mentors? Well, the person in charge of training pulmonary fellows was Thomas Petty. This is not Thomas Petty, the musician. This is Thomas Petty, the PEEP guy. If any of you ever used PEEP to treat patients in an ICU, he was the first person to describe that treatment. A brilliant, brilliant person. So the other mentor that I had who was incredible was John Weil. John Weil taught me how to teach. He taught me the mechanics of clinical research. We were required every month while I was training with him to do a presentation. After every presentation, John Weil would take me into his office and go through every slide one by one and go over the presentation and teach me what I could have done to do it better. He also encouraged me to do sleep studies, which is what I had done on the patient that I described. He encouraged me to do this, but there was no equipment to do sleep studies. So what was I going to be doing? Well, when you have lemons, and this lemon uh, was Leadville, Colorado, about 11,000 feet, is the highest permanent human habitation in North America, and this is the town. And the only industry in the town was a mine, a molybdenum mine. And so what I wanted to do was to study a condition called chronic mountain sickness. And this is a disease in which people had elevated hemoglobins and hematocrit, and they would have severe headaches and symptoms of heart failure, similar to a disease that cattle got at that altitude called brisket disease. And I wanted to study them, but I didn't have the equipment to study them. So three things aligned that allowed me to do this kind of research. One, Helen Grass. Now, who's Helen Grass? Helen Grass and her husband owned a company that made monitoring equipment for neurologists. And so she was written a letter. I wrote a letter to her, and she basically sent me a Grass Model 78. And some of you who ran sleep labs will remember this thing. The other thing that aligned was Hewlett-Packard, the company that you know that makes computers. In the 1970s, Hewlett-Packard was the #1 company that made instruments, electronic instruments, and they had a big medical presence. And they made a fiber optic ear oximeter that they had just introduced. And they sent us one of the very early ones, and I was lucky in that I could communicate with the engineers who told me a lot about this wonderful device that actually sat on the ear. The sensor sat on the ear, and it measured blood oxygen continuously. Well, what was the point of being able to measure something continuously if you couldn't record it and analyze the data? So the third thing that aligned was the NASA space program. Gene McCullough was a genius programmer who had worked for NASA, and what he did was he developed a computerized data acquisition system so we could collect all-night data. And so while I was a fellow in Colorado, I got a lot of stuff done. And I just want to highlight one paper that I did here. This is the paper called Impaired Oxygenation During Sleep and Excessive Polycythemia of High Altitude, Improvement with Respiratory Stimulation. And this was published in Sleep. And you'll notice that this was in volume 1, pages 3 to 17. It was, in fact, the first paper published in this brand new journal called Sleep. So the field was expanding, and I was lucky enough to have my work as the first paper in it. So in 1977, I helped organize a symposium right there in Aspen. Those are the maroon bells, if you've ever been in Aspen, and that's what they look like. They're absolutely gorgeous. And one of the speakers who was invited was somebody by the name of Christian Guilleminault. Now, Christian Guilleminault was a neuropsychiatrist who had come from France and went to Stanford to work in their sleep program. And Christian and I, we took walks between sessions, and what he convinced me was I needed to expand out of my sort of respiratory world and add to it the brain. I needed to add the rest of what sleep medicine and physiology would become. And so he convinced me to actually do this. So this was my first encounter with Stanford. And just to remind you that Christian Guilleminault was the first person to use the words together, sleep apnea, in this paper, Insomnia with Sleep Apnea, New Syndrome. However, when one reads the paper, you realize very quickly that he was not describing what I was talking about, which was obstructive sleep apnea. He was actually talking about central sleep apnea, but nevertheless, a brilliant, brilliant person. So he convinced me to go to my first sleep meeting, which was held in Palo Alto, where Stanford is, and the person in charge of the sleep program was Bill Dement. And I did a presentation on sleep and high altitude, and Bill was familiar with my article from 1974. And when we first met, he looked at me and he said, "My God, you're just a kid." The reality was, at that time, I really was just a kid. So that was my first contact with Bill Dement, 1977. So after I finished training in Colorado, Barbara and we moved to Winnipeg in Canada. And this is a photograph that I took from in front of my house of an aurora borealis, and a lot of you have the image of a huge amount of snow and incredible cold in that area. All of that is true, but there was a reason why we went to Winnipeg. At that time, Winnipeg had the best pulmonary section in Canada. Ruben Cherniak was actually head of medicine, and some of you may know that he moved to National Jewish Hospital in Denver and was its leader for many, many years. Nick Antonisson, most of you have never heard his name. However, if you've ever ordered oxygen for a COPD patient, he was the PI of the KNOT study that actually showed the beneficial effects of oxygen. Larry Wood was there. Larry Wood would later move to Chicago, and in Chicago he published really one of the first books on critical care, how to manage patients in a critical care unit. So it was the best pulmonary section in Canada. And Nick Antonisson was the head of pulmonary, and he basically said, go ahead and start a sleep lab. So this was the opportunity to create the first clinical lab in Canada, first clinical sleep lab, one of the very first in North America. And because we had such a strong pulmonary section, I did sleep studies in patients with COPD, interstitial lung disease, acromegaly, post-polio, congestive heart failure, kyphoscoliosis, and of course, obstructive sleep apnea. The other thing about Winnipeg, initially we thought we would stay there for 4 years and then move somewhere else. It turned out to be a great place to raise a family, and this was my family. This is a typical scene in the prairies. That's my wife, Barbara. That's my daughter, Shelley. She's holding my youngest son, Stephen, and there's Michael. And this was our life, and what you see is a typical prairie scene with grain elevators in the background and railway tracks. So need I say more? This was so instead of staying 4 years, we stayed 29. So when I first arrived to Winnipeg, and Nick Antonisson told me that, go ahead and start a sleep program. I was also put in charge of second year undergraduate medical school teaching. And so I had time to kill, and at that time I put together my first book. And this book was called The Pathophysiology of Respiration. And it really reviewed physiology and pathophysiology of all the conditions that were known at that time. And this was the book that was used by the second year students. So once I became an attending, my role changed. Up to that time, I had mentors who trained me. And now, being an attending physician, I became a mentor to others. And so fellows showed up. Fellows showed up. And they showed up from all over the world to come and be trained in sleep medicine from these countries, and there are a couple of others that I didn't list here. So fellows showed up, and they showed up from all sorts of fields. They showed up, some were neurology background, psychiatry, surgery, ENT, pulmonary, and cardiology as examples. So not only did I teach them, they taught me some of the stuff from their specialties. So a whole bunch of fellows showed up. My lab became fairly well known, and here I'm trying to explain how we measure respiratory effort. And there's a GRAS polygraph, and down here on the right, what we have is the Hewlett-Packard oximeter, and the person I'm explaining it to was Prince Philip. And anyways, my lab became very well known, and I've been asked to give lectures all over the place, and I met some people that to this day I have no idea who this guy was. Apparently, this was he was an official from the Vatican, and I have no idea who he was. They sat us together, and we had a lovely chat. So another serendipitous fluke happened. So right next door to my lab in Winnipeg, we were now in a new building, opened up something called the Manitoba Center for Health Policy and Evaluation. They had access to health records of over 1 million patients, all the patients who were in the province of Manitoba, and I was able to obtain data from my patients and match them to controls in this database. And this led to some of the first of a series of healthcare utilization papers in sleep disorders. And I'll just show you data from one of the papers. So this was a paper in which, if you look on the right above where it says evaluation, that's when we saw the patients who were subsequently diagnosed with obstructive sleep apnea syndrome, and we were able to go back in time up to 9 or 10 years to look at their healthcare utilization. And so this on the left, on the y-axis is the amount of money that was spent on each patient per year. And I was able to match them to BMI controls. In other words, people who were of the same weight as my patients. I could match each patient to 4 controls of the same weight, born almost exactly the same time in the same place. And I was able to match them to normal weight control, and this was data in female patients. And this showed very clearly that patients with obstructive sleep who were subsequently diagnosed with obstructive sleep apnea syndrome had increased healthcare utilization going back in time at least 9 years. And it wasn't just the obesity, the yellow data. It wasn't just the obesity. It was the fact that they had obstructive sleep apnea syndrome. So that's just an example of the kind of data we were able to get. And again, it was a fluke that these people were right next door. So now I'm going to go to 1984. I was asked to give a talk at the California Thoracic Society in Yosemite. And one of the other speakers at the California Thoracic Society was Tom Roth. And Tom Roth is one of the giants of sleep medicine and physiology. And again, we spent a lot of time together. I met his wife and at the time one child, and we did a lot of walking together and talking together, and that led to a decision to work together on a research project that I'll describe in a minute. And we also decided that a clinical textbook was needed. So the project that we collaborated on, so in the mid-1980s, there was no commercially available CPAP system, really. And so his clinic in Detroit, Michigan, had a huge number of patients who had been diagnosed with sleep apnea over many years, but who had never been treated. So what we did was we looked at whether these patients died or not, and we looked at whether or not this was associated with how bad their apnea was. And what this slide showed was patients who had an apnea index number of times they stopped breathing of greater than 20 had by about 9 or 10 years, 60% of them were alive, meaning 40% had died, and that's pretty bad. And people that had mild sleep apnea, they were still alive. And the other thing that this research showed, that the people that died were not the older people with sleep apnea, but the younger people with sleep apnea. So this was a work which we submitted to the New England Journal of Medicine, and the New England Journal of Medicine rejected it like instantly, got a letter from the editor basically saying that the readers of the New England Journal would not be interested in this paper. So we submitted it to the Journal of Chest, and this became the most cited paper in sleep medicine for several years until 1993, and yet it had been rejected by the New England Journal of Medicine. I wish I had kept that rejection letter. So in 1985, we explored the idea of a textbook. I asked colleagues what they thought. Tom and I both thought we needed a textbook. Christian Guilleminault did not think there was enough known to fill a textbook. He said there really wasn't enough meat. Bill Dement said, and I had visited Stanford at the time, without a textbook, you can't have a field. So we started to work on it. And here we have the three of us at a meeting. And this lineup there is the final dialogue of the movie Casablanca. I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. We worked together for the next more than 30 years working on the textbook. And what was the inspiration for the title of the textbook? Well, Osler. So the library at McGill was the Osler Library, and Osler was the most famous clinician that came out of McGill. He moved to the U.S. To Johns Hopkins and other places, and eventually ended up at Oxford as the professor of medicine. His book, which was a landmark book in around the turn of the last, actually not the last century, but the century before, was called The Principles and Practice of Medicine. And that was the inspiration for our book. And this is the first edition. The first edition had these sections. And the book was modest in size. It had a total of about 750 pages, and this is what the book looked like. And it was called The Principles and Practice of Sleep Medicine. So then every 5 years or so, there was another edition. And, each cover was different. And as time went on, the book became greater and greater. And we moved. My family moved to Connecticut. Yale was gutsy to hire me. I was 64 years old. But I think they got their money's worth from hiring me. I worked at the VA and I established the first program for remote monitoring of CPAP machines, of patients on CPAP. And I also introduced oral therapy of obstructive sleep apnea using dental appliances. And at Yale, I established the first real fellowship program that actually had funding, and we ultimately had 4 fellows. I continued scholarly stuff, and I also established a course for undergraduates at Yale, not medical undergraduates, but college undergraduates, called The Mystery of Sleep, that I'll talk about in a little while. So we had about 20 sleep fellows in the past few years who have trained in our sleep program. They've populated academic centers, for example, at Yale, Mayo Clinic, Duke, and some have established clinical practices throughout the United States. And it was a challenge teaching the fellows during COVID, because during COVID, the teaching often had to be remote. And there you could see the screen that I was looking at, and you could see me in the upper corner of some of these screens, and these are some of the fellows that we had. So our fellows have always, to me, been an inspiring group. The other inspiring group were the attendings in the sleep program, and I'm not going to go through the names of all of them, but what I will show you are the ones that actually trained in our program and are now on faculty and are now tremendous researchers, teachers, clinicians. So the group is inspiring, and I'm inspired by the trainees. So this is the last photograph we were able to take pre-pandemic of the people, not just some of the attendings in the sleep program, but some of the staff that were in the clinic and in the fellowship office. And this is the last group that we had a photograph of, the entire team, and it was a dream team. So meanwhile, we were working on the 7th edition, and the 7th edition had grown. It had grown. It now had a huge number of sections that didn't exist before. We had sections on neurological disease, cardiovascular disease, psychiatric disease, and transition from childhood to adulthood, older people, women's health. So we now had 213 chapters, over 2,000 pages. And the look of the book changed as well. So the 6th edition, this was the picture of the 6th edition, and this is now the 7th edition cover. And there are certain things about the 7th edition that I wanted to point out. The 7th edition came out really at the beginning of 2022, just a few months ago. So Kathy Goldstein was added to the senior editorial team. And Kathy is I'm happy to say, has just been promoted to professor at the University of Michigan. And hopefully she will help carry the book forward. And, you know, what a joy it was to work with her. I also worked with a very large number of what we call associate editors who were in charge of various sections. And it was during COVID that the book had its gestation. And getting a book together during COVID was really, really tough. There were about 5 authors who died, not necessarily of COVID. I don't know the cause of death of all of them, but about 5 died who would have contributed to the book. And this was heartbreaking. And Dr. Dement, Bill Dement died. Bill Dement died, and he was really the inspiration for the very first edition of the book. So, as I mentioned before, I taught an undergraduate course at Yale starting about 6 years ago. And this is the class from 2018, and I'm on the right wearing the bright yellow jacket. And Dr. Suman Bottom, who's the third person from the left, his head just peeking out beyond one of the students. And the students, what a wonderful group of students. There were people from all disciplines who were taking this course. Some were from the sciences and some were from the humanities. We had people in the course who were from music, who were from art, and we taught them not just the science of sleep, but how sleep could improve their lives and their futures. So the public needed to know about sleep, and there were several books that I wrote specifically for the public. Woman's Guide to Sleep, and the last one is The Mystery of Sleep. So I'm close to the end now, and I can't not tell you what an honor it has been to treat more than 50,000 patients in my career. More than 50,000 patients in my career, and I have learned from them. And some of them had unique diseases that really taught me, and I was able to teach others about their specific conditions. And they all gave me, all the people you see here gave me permission to use their images in educational material. And it has been an honor to treat them. But after 51 years, it was perhaps time to move on. So I'm going to end now by telling you what shaped me. What shaped me was my mother, who instilled in me a love of writing. She taught poetry in slave labor camps. My father, he was a painter. Besides being a butcher, he was a painter. And he instilled in me, and I guess this is genetics, a love of art. And you could see my love of art coming through on the covers of the various editions of the textbook. My wife Barbara, and she basically taught me to love life. And my children gave me unwavering support. I mean, I spent a lot of time in the basement rehearsing talks, writing papers and stuff like that. And they always supported what I was doing. They knew that I was doing was important to me, and they supported that. So what a career needs, and I hope I've established this for you, you need champions and mentors who believe in you. They need to have passion. You need to have passion about what you are doing. You need a supportive family. You need patience. And sometimes articles are going to be rejected. And sometimes when they're rejected, there's a good reason for them to be rejected. But if the stuff is really good, you got to persist and get it published. And of course, serendipity. There were many times in my life when I took a certain path only because it was a fluke. I had the opportunity. So I'm going to end now with a quote from a poem, The Road Not Taken. I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Thank you, thank you, thank you.